A few years ago, I attended a conference for First Call pastors that was all about conflict management. And one of the first exercises that they had us do was to line up across the room in order of how much we liked conflict, with one side of the room being that we just loved it and might even seek it out on purpose, and the opposite side of the room being that you avoided it at all costs, and even the thought of conflict started to make you feel a little queasy. Personally, I would label myself as being reluctantly willing when it comes to conflict. So I positioned myself about halfway between the middle of the room and the anti-conflict wall. I don't love conflict, but I'm willing to engage in it when it comes to issues that I find important, or when it comes to values that I feel I need to stand up for and defend. And I'm especially willing to engage in conflict when it means standing up for or protecting someone that I love. Those of us that are 2s on the Enneagram can really, channel our inner 8 when it comes to those kinds of situations. And for those of you that are wondering, yes, there were actually people in that group that walked right over to the I love conflict side of the room and practically leaned up against the wall, which was a little surprising at first, but I just made a mental note of who those people were, and it was all good. I bring all this up because our gospel story for today is all about how to respond when conflict arises between two people. In somewhat rare fashion, Jesus actually gives us specific, detailed, step-by-step instructions about what to do in these kinds of situations. There's no vague parable that's open to interpretation, no confusing metaphor that needs to be unpacked. It's surprisingly straightforward. And I'll be honest, I kind of wish it wasn't so straightforward. Because when I sat down to read this passage, I got as far as the first step before I started saying, well, yeah, but, and arguing back at my computer screen. Jesus' first step in this whole process is that if another member of the church sins against you, go and point out the fault when the two of you are alone. Now, I love how direct Jesus is calling us to be. I think that clear, direct communication is so important when you're dealing with conflict. But I don't love the fact that it's the person who was sinned against that has to be the one to go and initiate this whole interaction. Why couldn't Jesus' comments have been directed at the person who had committed the offense? Why couldn't he have said, if you realize that you have sinned against someone else, go to that person and make amends? Why does the person who was wronged have to be responsible for initiating this process of reconciliation? That's not fair. The obligation to go and make things right should be on the person who screwed up in the first place. Plus, what about those situations where it's not always safe to go and confront the person that has sinned against them? Like in cases of domestic violence, where going to confront the abuser is the last thing that a person should do alone. So I texted all of these annoyances with this passage to 2 of my friends who are also pastors. And we actually had some pretty fruitful conversations. One of them brought up the fact that this really boils down to how we understand the Bible. As much as we might like it to be like a magic 8-ball, where you can ask any question and get an answer, that's not really how it works. Rather than provide us with specific answers to every single question imaginable, which would make for a ridiculously long book, the Bible aims at providing us overarching values that we are encouraged to live by, and general wisdom and guidance that can be applied and extrapolated to help us figure things out. The wisdom that is contained in these pages is meant to be used in conjunction with our own common sense and good judgment, and between all of them together, we're able to figure out a way forward. So when it comes to the text for today, yes, there are going to be certain situations where directly confronting someone who has wronged you isn't the best choice. And in those situations, listen to your gut. Jesus isn't calling you to put yourself in danger here. Figure out how to resolve the conflict in a way that protects your safety and integrity. But just because this advice doesn't work in every situation doesn't mean that it's not still good advice. As my other friend pointed out, in the vast majority of cases, the process that Jesus lays out for us is the most direct and fastest way for two people to be reconciled with one another. Even though it might not be fair, even though in an ideal world people would realize when they had done something wrong or acted in a way that was harmful or hurt someone else's feelings, and then they would be the ones to go and make amends, that's unfortunately not usually what happens. And choosing to wait around for the person that wronged you to suddenly realize it and then also have a change of heart, well, let's just say that might leave you waiting for a long time. So when conflict inevitably arises, and it is indeed inevitable, the best course of action is just to be direct. And we aren't called to go home and gossip or complain with our partner or our best friend. We're not supposed to post vague, attention-seeking things on social media, also known as vague booking. We're supposed to go directly to that person, state our grievances, and work towards a resolution. And as I was thinking about all this, I was reminded of one particular conflict that I had with a roommate of mine. For the sake of protecting the anonymity of those involved, all identifying details have been changed or otherwise obfuscated in the following account. Now, despite the reputation that I'm earning around here with my mission to clean and organize all of the storage spaces on campus, it might surprise you to know that I haven't always been so clean and well organized in my own personal life. And I'm sure if you were to ask my wife, there is still plenty of room for improvement. This story happened a number of years ago, and I'd been living with the roommate for about 8 months at the time with little to no issues, or rather, little to no issues that I was aware of, at least, until one day when I came home to a typed, multi-paragraph letter taped to my bedroom door, chronicling all of the things that I had done to annoy my roommate, most of them having to do with cleanliness. Now, some of them were very legitimate, like making a mess right after he had vacuumed. Some were less legitimate, like how I had spilled something while cooking and not realized it, so he had left a sponge on the countertop next to the stovetop to let me know that it was dirty and that I needed to clean it. Obviously, that's what you would get from seeing a sponge on the countertop, right? The worst was probably when I was absent-mindedly unloading the dishwasher, and I accidentally put back a spoon that hadn't been fully cleaned. I discovered that I had done that later, a few days later, when I opened the drawer and found a sticky note attached to the spoon that said, "This spoon is dirty. Why is it in the silverware drawer?" I knew that something had to be done, and I didn't like this indirect, some might call it passive-aggressive way of communicating, so I decided to address it head-on. And that night, we sat down and had a talk. I apologized for my role in the situation, and I acknowledged the ways that I had messed up, and I asked if in the future he would just tell me when I had done something that annoyed him so that I could at least try and change my behavior before it boiled over into resentment. And I thought that the talk went really well and that we had reached an understanding. Keyword there is thought. For about a week or two, I made a serious effort to be cleaner and tidier, but then one day I received a 6-paragraph email detailing further cleanliness crimes that I had committed, and it was at that point that I started to look for a new roommate. To be fair, this is not a clean-cut example, as neither of us handled the situation perfectly. But really, when is life ever perfectly clear-cut? And when do any of us ever handle situations like this perfectly? I was in the wrong because I absolutely did every single one of the things that annoyed my roommate. There's no denying that. He was in the wrong too, though. for not coming to me sooner so that I could have tried to do better. And then I was in the wrong again, because after my first attempt at reconciliation failed, I just sort of gave up and jumped ship. But Jesus is very clear. If at first you don't succeed, try again. Bring some trusted friends into the mix, people who will be neutral witnesses and help mediate the situation. And then if that doesn't work, bring it to the church as a whole. I can only imagine how motivating that third step would have been to the community that this gospel was written for. What better incentive to make amends and sort through your problems than the threat of being forced to air out all of that dirty laundry in front of the entire congregation? Can you imagine that? If right before the passing of the peace, we added a section to the service, called it something like the airing of grievances, an opportunity to publicly hash out any active conflicts going on in the congregation. I'm not sure if that would increase or decrease attendance, to be honest. I suppose it would depend on whether or not you were involved in any of those conflicts. What I really appreciate about this passage is how realistic and honest it is about the human condition. Jesus' teachings are filled with instructions about how we are supposed to live, how we're supposed to treat one another. We are to love one another the same way that God loves us. We're supposed to turn the other cheek and love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us. And if Jesus expected us to do all of those things perfectly, then there would be no need for today's passage. If we followed those other commandments 100% of the time, no one would sin against anyone else, thus eliminating the need for this step-by-step instructions on how to repair a broken relationship. But Jesus knew that people weren't going to be perfect. He knew that no matter our best intentions, all of us are going to fall short and mess up. It's only a matter of time before we accidentally do something that hurts someone else, or in the heat of the moment say something that we regret later. There isn't a single one of us who is ever going to succeed in truly loving our neighbor in all that we do, because we're all human, which is why he gave us such an ambitious goal to aim for, while at the same time giving us a roadmap for how to work our way back when we inevitably fall short. And just like Jesus is never willing to give up on us, he calls us to do the same for one another. If all of our attempts at reconciliation fail, if we go to the person and then bring some friends and then involve the church and things still aren't resolved, the final recourse that we are offered is that we should treat that person like a Gentile or a tax collector. Now, on the surface, that might seem like permission to finally write that person off for good. I mean, Gentiles were outsiders who worshipped false gods and were meant to be avoided at all costs. And tax collectors? They were employees of the occupying Roman forces who not only took money from their own people to send to a foreign dictator, but also overcharged their own people, lining their own pockets in the process. Obviously, they should be scorned and excluded and ostracized, right? But hang on a minute, because that's how most people would have treated a Gentile or a tax collector. But how did Jesus treat them? He welcomed them and ate with them, forgave and healed them. He loved them unconditionally. He loved and accepted them exactly as they were, which is what we are called to try to do as well. Because ultimately, we have a God who values relationship and reconciliation above all else. A God who believes in second chances and has hope that all of us can be the people that God knows we can be. And as tempting as it might be to just write off the people who sin against us, we are called to live by a different standard. We are called to talk with one another instead of about one another. To treat conflict as something that will naturally arise in any community, that it isn't something to be feared, nor is it something that can be ignored. Instead, we are called to deal with it in ways that are healthy and direct, in the hopes that healing might happen eventually. We can't always control what happens to us, but we can control how we respond. And when we respond by loving and listening, we can never go wrong. Amen.